The great age of exploration began nearly 600 years ago in Europe. It lasted for 3 centuries, and during this time, most of the world was explored by sailing ships. And new European settlements went up all over the world. And as a result, Europeans brought their way of life and their religion to much of the rest of the world. There is no doubt that the age of exploration was one of the most amazing times in history. But have you ever wondered how it all began? To find the beginnings of the age of exploration, we must go to Portugal, which is one of the smallest countries in Europe, a country that stretches along the Atlantic Ocean on the western edge of Europe. Portugal is a land where most of the people live in small villages and worship in Catholic churches. Portugal is a place where cork trees like this one are a common sight, and where many people make their living from the sea. 600 years ago, when the age of exploration was just beginning, most of the Portuguese people would probably have lived within sight of castles like this one, which were the fortress homes of powerful noblemen, such as their great ruler, the king. Around the year 1420, the King of Portugal's 3rd son, Prince Henry, wanted to do something that would help his country become richer and more powerful. He wanted Portuguese explorers to be the first people to find a sea route from Europe, around Africa, to the far eastern parts of Asia, places such as China, India, and Japan. He believed that if the Portuguese could be the first to sail to Asia, then they could take the rich trade in Asian spices, porcelains, silks, and jewels away from their Muslim enemies, followers of the Islamic faith, who had been controlling that trade for hundreds of years. Back then, one of the main reasons no one had ever sailed around Africa to reach Asia was that sailors were afraid of what they might run into. They had heard stories that about 1 week's journey down the coast lay a sea of darkness filled with terrifying sea monsters, while other tales told of lands where strange creatures lived that were half human and half animal. Prince Henry decided that the best way to find out if these stories were true or not was to send a ship there. But before doing that, he knew his sailors would have to be very well prepared. That was why, around the year 1420, Prince Henry built a school of navigation on this rocky peninsula in southern Portugal. And here at the school, he brought together map makers, sea captains, geographers, astronomers, and experts of all sorts to learn everything they could about the sea, about sailing, and about shipbuilding. Prince Henry even built a house for himself not far from the school, high on a cliff above the sea, and he also founded shipyards nearby to build the excellent newly invented ships called caravels. Caravels were very different from the ships that had come before them, for they had triangular sails that let them sail into the wind. They also were easier to steer and could carry a lot of food and water for long sea voyages. But just having good ships was not enough, because it was still quite easy to get lost at sea. And to solve this problem, they needed better navigational instruments. One such instrument was the quadrant, pictured here. It let sailors find out what latitude they were at. Latitudes are imaginary lines created by geographers that circle the Earth from east to west, while longitudes divide the Earth from north to south. And by knowing their latitude and then using a compass to learn in which direction they were going, Portuguese ships could be far out at sea and still have a pretty good idea of where they were. About 13 years after Prince Henry opened his school, his sailors were finally ready to start exploring the coast of Africa and to enter the Sea of Darkness. And although the sailors were afraid at first, they soon found out that the Sea of Darkness and its monsters were nothing more than stories, for all they found when they got there was just the long coast of Africa, stretching out as far as they could see. The Portuguese explorers kept moving down the coast for almost 30 years until, in 1460, Prince Henry died. And at the time of his death, the explorers still hadn't reached the tip of Africa. As the years went by, the ships from Portugal went further and further south. After crossing the equator, they discovered a beautiful river flowing out of the jungle called the Congo. They even explored up the Congo River until they could go no further. But finally, in 1488, over 50 years after they had started, a Portuguese ship under the command of Captain Bartolomeu Dias reached the southern tip of the African continent, a place now known as the Cape of Good Hope. During the long years it took to reach Africa's tip, the Portuguese explorers recorded what they had seen, such as the many beautiful birds, the strange animals, and the unusual tribes of people. They wrote down descriptions of the native villages they had visited, made excellent maps, and always put up stone markers like this one to claim the lands they discovered for Portugal. Their ships also carried priests who worked at converting the native people to Christianity. And the explorers built outposts where they traded cheap cloth and things made from iron for gold, ivory, and furs. The Portuguese grew wealthy from African gold, but they also got rich by taking African people back to Europe to be sold as slaves. In spite of the money that they were making in Africa, the Portuguese still had their sights set on the even richer treasures of Asia. And knowing that it was now possible to sail around Africa, the Portuguese king gave one of his best captains, a man named Vasco da Gama, 4 ships and 170 men with which to sail to India. And in July of 1497, they left behind the familiar shores of Portugal and headed south. It took many months before they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and began to sail north. On the east coast of Africa, they stopped off in the port of Mozambique, and it was here that they first saw Muslim ships filled with trade goods from India. The sailors were thrilled by this sight. However, many of the Muslim traders didn't want the Portuguese interfering with their business. But after escaping north to the port of Malindi, Vasco da Gama paid a friendly Arab seaman to guide his ships across the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese ships finally reached India in May of 1498, and da Gama and his sailors were overjoyed. After a while, Vasco da Gama was able to make a deal, and he loaded up his ships with a small amount of cinnamon and with 80 tons of peppercorns before sailing back to Portugal. The trip back home took almost a year, and by then, out of the 170 sailors who had started the voyage, only 55 were left alive. But despite such a heavy loss of life, the great voyage of Vasco da Gama had been a tremendous success. For the dream of Prince Henry the Navigator had finally come true, because a Portuguese explorer had become the first person to discover a sea route from Europe to the eastern parts of Asia. And it was because of this amazing voyage that the tiny country of Portugal grew to become one of the richest and most powerful nations on earth. True or false? The school founded by Prince Henry helped the Portuguese gain the knowledge they needed to reach India by sea. True or false? 600 years ago, no European had ever seen the southern tip of Africa. True or false? Portuguese explorers had no interest in converting native people to Christianity. True or false? On the west coast of Africa, Portuguese explorers discovered the delta of the Nile River. True or false? Bartholomew Dias was the first European to reach the Cape of Good Hope.